Did you know that democracy wasn't always common? In a time when kings and nobles ruled, Athens was different because it tried self-government. This video explains the beginnings of Athenian democracy, from the changes made by Solon to the important leadership of Pisistratus. Come with us as we learn about how ancient Athens set the foundation for the democratic ideas we value today. The foundations of representative democracy, which is prevalent in the West today, go back thousands of years. The famous Greek city-state Athens started along the path to adopting this system of government in the Mycenaean era. Athens was initially only one of several cities in the area. Thucydides tells us that Athens and its environs were unified into a single city-state by the legendary king Theseus. Athens underwent a dramatic transition from monarchy to the government of three officials known as archons, Basileus, Polemarch, and eponymous Archon by the 7th century BC. These archons were in charge of general administration, military matters, and religious ceremonies, respectively. Beneath them was the Areopagus, which was a council of elders like the Roman Senate and possessed considerable power. The Areopagus was probably an oligarchic body composed of former archons and other distinguished citizens, which would suggest that the power was in the hands of a select few. This change was a transition from the previous forms of government and set the stage for Athens to become one of the first cities to embrace the concept of democracy in the ancient world. The archons, with the council of the Areopagus, were the leaders of early archaic Athens. However, competition and rivalry were always simmering in the higher circles of Athenian society, as in the rest of Greece despite the growing wealth of the city. In 632 BC, an Athenian noble named Cylon attempted to overthrow the Athenian state with the support of his wealthy friends and his father-in-law, who was the ruler of Megara. They seized the Acropolis, but did not receive expected reinforcement. Cylon was besieged and eventually fled, while his supporters were killed by Megacles, the eponymous archon of Athens, and an Alcmaeonid. However, about 30 years later, Cylon's family regained power and charged the Alcmaeonids, their noble enemies, with impiety for murdering Cylon's supporters who took refuge in a temple after the failed coup. To everyone's shock, the whole Alcmaeonid family was exiled from Athens and condemned. Even their ancestors' ashes were removed from the city. This act was probably an excuse to get rid of an unpopular family in the middle of the aristocratic struggles and machinations. By the early 6th century BC, Athens and much of Greece were experiencing social upheaval, especially among the poor freemen who were farmers. Some suffered under the hectomorioi system, which was similar to medieval serfdom, in which tenant farmers gave a sixth of their harvest to the landowner, which only worsened poverty and discontent among the populace. This structure most likely developed as a result of debt forcing individual farmers' land ownership to shift to wealthy creditors. But many hectomorioi could not afford to pay the sixth tithe, and by 600, there was bitterness and indignation. Many of the impoverished farmers had been compelled to sell themselves and their families into slavery in order to pay off the debt, as Athens was a city that kept slaves. At this time, similar circumstances were prevalent throughout Greece as well, and as a result, numerous cities had seen revolutions that culminated in the ascent to power of a single person as a tyrant. The Athens aristocratic families were certainly aware of this, as well as the potential for one family to attempt a similar action within their city. Perhaps this was what the Alcmaeonid family were trying to achieve in order to anger the other aristocrats so much. As we all are aware, the aristocratic plans of nearly all the prehistoric civilizations were extremely aggressive, and if any one family had come to power, it would have most probably led to a lot of unrest. The conditions that would give rise to this threat would have to be resolved, and this would have to be done soon. Tyrants required backing, and a prospective Athenian dictator might obtain it from poor farmers or other vulnerable populace by pledging to improve their status. It may also have dawned on the rulers of Athens that this perpetual turbulence might hinder the formation of a united force when required, and it was getting close. Megara, the city-state to the west of Athens, was gradually turning into an enemy, and even seized Salamis. Everyone understood that only a drastic measure could be taken. For this reason, the Areopagus decided to appoint a dictator to govern Athens in order to solve the state's problems. a dictator who was called Solon. He was a nobleman who claimed to be a descendant of one of the kings of ancient Athens and was chosen for the position of the wisest man in Athens. Solon was rich, but he was not a landowner, and this made him different from the rest of the nobles and deprived him of their company. More relevant to the job he now had, Solon had also gained the reputation of being a man of sound practical judgment and of moderate political views. He was also a poet, and many of his poems have survived to this day. Solon's reforms were motivated by a sense of fairness, social ethics, and understanding of the political dynamics in Athens. He clearly understood that he was dealing with an unfair society, even by ancient standards, that favored a hereditary elite at the expense of everyone else. While Solon was motivated to make significant reforms, he was also determined to do it without inflicting injustice on those with money and influence. He saw himself as a mediator, standing between the well-born, or agathoi, and the poor freeman, or kaki. On his watch, balance would be achieved and reforms enacted, which would allow neither side to unjustly triumph over the other. Any other way, he believed, would fail and result in mass bloodshed. Solon's first concern was the primary grievance of the poor in Athens: debt. He abolished the system which allowed lending with a person as security for repayment, and the hectomoroi system liberated those who had been trapped in that position and even gave them back ownership of their old land. This series of debt-canceling acts was known as Saisaktheia, shaking off the burdens. The poor subsequently began to demand seizures of land from the rich, but Solon remarkably did not cave to pressure on this front. He would be a moderate, and saw this as simple greed and pursuit of excess. Such enforced equality in the distribution of wealth was neither just nor necessary. The cause of the poor would not be advanced through injustice to others. Nevertheless, Solon knew that large-scale inequality was an obstacle to the unity of the polis, and saved the people from hunger by limiting the export of grain, which would otherwise be expensive. In his own words, Solon wrote in a poem, "I wrote laws for the low-born and the well-born, and gave everyone straight justice." To top it all, he established a law court called the Heleia, where all the citizens could sue to get justice. Besides solving the debt problems in a revolutionary way, Solon also opened the political life of Athens for more people. The political elite of the hereditary rich noble birth would be replaced with a broader representation of the Athenian population. It was divided into 4 classes on the basis of landed property, wealth, and produce: the Pentakosiomedminoi, the Hippies, Zugatai, and Thetes, from the aristocrats to the laborers. In this newly categorized system, the archons were retained, but election to the post was now open to anyone from the top 2 wealth classes. Although it is a fact that almost all of the former aristocracy joined these 2 groups, it is also a fact that it was a large group of non-aristocrats. This had a knock-on effect which is crucial. Since a member of the Areopagus Council was elected from ex-archons, it was not as aristocratic as before. Over time, lower offices, which appear to have been mainly dealing with financial issues, were accessible to the first 2 classes, and also the third. But the Thetes were barred from politics, but allowed to be part of the new popular assembly known as the Ecclesia. Curiously enough, Solon appears to have had a guarantee from the Areopagus that his reforms would be acceptable for a decade, no matter what they were. It must have been very bad in Athens for such a drastic measure to be considered. When he was done, Solon laid aside his supreme powers and went abroad for 10 years. These were revolutionary changes, but unfortunately they didn't resolve every problem as the great reformer had hoped. Disruptive rivalry continued unabated amongst the noble families, and many farmers found themselves once again in debt due to lack of funds. They couldn't be enslaved anymore, but were still chained to their creditors due to this debt. In the years after Solon's reforms, there were still ongoing signs of conflict in Athens. Archons were repeatedly left unappointed due to a lack of factional consensus, and on another occasion, an outgoing archon even refused to lay down the position, aiming to become a tyrant. In some ways, Solon's reforms had changed everything, but in many others, nothing had changed at all. This time, Athens succumbed to the very fate that Solon had been so emphatic about, and three major factions arose. The Athenians of the plain were led by Lycurgus, son of Aristotelides, while the coastal faction was led by Megacles of the Alcmaeonid family, which seemed to have come back into the city after being cursed and banished before, and were at their old tricks again. Apart from these groups, there was the hill faction, which was led by a man called Pisistratus. Amazingly, the people were apparently persuaded that the woman was Athena, and so Pisistratus returned. Even Herodotus, who lived about a century after these events, stated, "They devised a plan to bring Pisistratus back, which to my mind was so exceedingly foolish that it is strange." As expected, he became entangled in factionalism and was removed. Finally, in 546, Pisistratus was placed in Athens with the support of Thebes and Thracian mercenaries, and he remained in power until his death in 527. In the present period, dictators are often viewed as terrible by definition, although most sources claim that Pisistratus was a benign dictator who was beneficial to his people. He mainly upheld Solon's rules and demonstrated that they were effective, but he also ensured that all of the highest positions went to his own allies. His governance also marked the beginning of the golden age in the life of Athenians. Measures were taken to address the economic status of the poor farmers by providing them with state loans and grants. These financial aids were financed by a flat 10% tax on all produce, which was, in effect, a regressive policy of shifting excess profits from rich farmers to the poor ones, because the former paid more tax in absolute terms. To increase the wealth of Athens and his own popularity, Pisistratus commissioned many works of art and architecture, including statues and temples. This was a common strategy because, on one hand, it generated employment, while on the other hand, it was an emblem of national pride. The tyrant also had a great concern in state religion and the big festivals which the Athenians used to celebrate. He founded a new occasion, which was called for centuries as the Dionysia, and increased other festivals, especially the Panathenaea, the festival dedicated to Athena, the protector of Athens. More significant was his patronization of arts and culture, through which he was able to lure many of the most renowned writers of his time to Athens. For instance, it was during this period of tyranny that the well-known Greek tragedy style of play started to emerge in Hellas. In short, Athens was quickly becoming a cultural hub, and Professor Thomas N. Mitchell put the situation like this: "It is difficult to deny that Pisistratus' cultural policy and his general support of the arts played a significant role in the preparation of the conditions for the subsequent golden age of art, architecture, literature, and philosophy that blossomed in Athens in the following century." However, Pisistratus' rule also had other impacts which were not so economic in their nature. Through the eviction or migration of many noble families who were against the tyrant, he weakened the already declining power of the noble class. The others who stayed alive thought it was better to surrender and obey, so that they could keep their property and ranks. Because of Pisistratus' extended reign of terror, people were accustomed to looking on him for their well-being, which eventually undermined the earlier forms of reliance that had supported the aristocratic system. There is ample evidence of increased wealth during this time, and the dictator undoubtedly provided a better living for the lower and middle-class people who were his main source of support. The entire nature of Pisistratus' reign, together with his upholding of Solon's previous reforms, made the restoration of the old aristocratic order quite improbable. Thus, by the time the great dictator passed away in 527, he had contributed to creating the groundwork for both a new democracy that would arise in the ensuing century and an unparalleled period of cultural prosperity.